Martha Anderson's arthritic fingers froze around her walking stick, her breath catching in her throat as the impossible sound reached her ears. In 73 years of living in these Oregon woods, she had never heard a wild bear cry like a human mother losing her child. The massive python wasn't just attacking, it was methodically crushing the life from Luna while her two cubs watched helplessly. Martha's hiking boots slipped on wet leaves as she stumbled forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "Dear God," she whispered, remembering her grandson's face the day he died in her arms. The bear's dark eyes found hers across 20 feet of forest floor, and Martha saw something that stopped her cold. Recognition, desperation, and an unmistakable plea for help that transcended species. Her cell phone showed no signal bars. The nearest ranger station was 3 miles away. What could one old woman possibly do? And how much time did they have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 hours earlier, Martha Anderson had awakened to another empty morning in her small cabin on the edge of Cascade National Forest. The silence felt heavier than usual. No phone calls, no visitors. Just the persistent tick of Robert's old grandfather clock marking time she wasn't sure how to fill anymore. At 73, Martha carried herself with the practiced dignity of a woman who had spent 40 years managing unruly third graders, but her shoulders had begun to curve inward like parentheses around a life that felt increasingly parenthetical. Her daughter Sarah hadn't called in 8 months, not since their bitter argument about Martha's stubborn refusal to face reality. The reality being a small house in Portland's senior community, where Martha could be properly looked after. "I've been looking after myself just fine, thank you very much," Martha muttered to her reflection as she laced up her hiking boots. The doctors had other ideas about what fine meant. "Early-stage dementia," they'd whispered, as if saying it quietly might soften the blow. Some days the fog rolled in thick, stealing names and faces she'd known for decades. But other days, like today, her mind felt sharp as her grandmother's sewing needles. The morning ritual never changed. Coffee black as Robert's old Buick, 2 pieces of toast with Eleanor Wilson's homemade strawberry jam, and the 10-mile weather forecast that determined whether she'd take the short loop or the long one through Whispering Pines Trail. Eleanor was her closest neighbor, married to Dr. James Wilson, Martha's oldest friend since they'd taught Sunday school together in the 70s. James had been acting strange lately, distant and preoccupied whenever Martha ran into him at Miller's General Store. Eleanor looked frailer each time Martha saw her, though the Wilsons kept their troubles private. Small towns had a way of broadcasting everyone's business except when you actually needed to know something important. This morning called for the long trail. Martha needed the validation that her legs could still carry her 5 miles through terrain that challenged hikers half her age. The familiar weight of her day pack, water bottle, granola bars, first aid kit, and the emergency whistle Robert had insisted she carry felt reassuring against her back. The forest welcomed her like an old friend. 43 years of these walks had taught her every root and rock, every seasonal change in the light filtering through Douglas fir and western hemlock. Here, she wasn't a burden or a problem to be managed. Here, she was simply Martha, moving through a world that had watched her hair turn silver and her step grow more careful, but never questioned her right to belong. She paused at her favorite overlook, where the trail curved around a granite outcropping that offered glimpses of Mount Hood in the distance. Robert had proposed to her here in 1968, stammering through a speech he'd practiced for weeks. "Growing old isn't so bad," she told the mountain, "when you're growing old somewhere beautiful." But growing old alone, that was the part the guidebooks never prepared you for. The sound that stopped Martha cold wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human. It was something far more heartbreaking, a low, keening wail that seemed to carry the weight of every mother's worst nightmare. Martha had heard that sound once before, 27 years ago, when her daughter Sarah had lost her first baby at 6 months old. She pushed through a curtain of sword ferns, her arthritic knees protesting as she stepped over a fallen log. The forest floor here was spongy with decades of decomposed needles, muffling her footsteps as she moved toward the source of that terrible crying. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but something deeper than curiosity pulled her forward, the same instinct that had made her run toward the school playground when children screamed, not away from it. The clearing opened before her like a wound in the forest. In the center, a scene from her worst nightmares was playing out in slow motion. A massive Burmese python, easily 12 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, had coiled around a female black bear. The snake's muscular body wrapped around the bear's chest and abdomen in a grotesque embrace, each coil tightening with methodical precision. But it was the cubs that broke Martha's heart completely. Two small black bears, no bigger than cocker spaniels, circled their trapped mother with desperate whimpers. They would approach, trying to nurse from her swollen teats, then retreat as the python's massive head swayed in their direction. The mother bear's eyes, dark and intelligent and filled with the kind of anguish Martha recognized from her own mirror, tracked her baby's movements even as her breathing grew more labored. "Sweet Jesus," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own pulse thundering in her ears. She'd lived in these woods her entire adult life, had seen plenty of nature's cruelties, but this was different. This was wrong in a way that went deeper than the food chain or natural selection. The python wasn't feeding, it was simply killing, with the patient efficiency of a machine designed for death. Each time the bear exhaled, the snake tightened its grip, preventing her from drawing a full breath back in. It was suffocation by degrees, and Martha could see from the bear's dulled movements that she was losing the battle. Martha's practical mind screamed at her to back away slowly, to hike back to the trailhead and call for help. But her cell phone showed the same mocking, no service message it always displayed this deep in the forest. The nearest ranger station was 3 miles of steep terrain away, and Tommy Richardson wouldn't even be on duty until this afternoon. By then, the mother bear would be dead, and her cubs would be orphaned heading into winter, a death sentence as certain as the python's coils. The smaller cub, obviously the runt of the litter, had stopped trying to approach its mother. It sat on its haunches about 10 feet away, releasing small huffing sounds that Martha realized were baby bear sobs. The larger cub continued its frantic attempts to reach its mother, even as the python's tail end lashed toward it in warning. Martha found herself stepping into the clearing before she'd consciously made the decision to move. Her hiking boots snapped a dry branch, and the sound cracked through the forest like a gunshot. The python's wedge-shaped head swiveled toward her with ancient, reptilian interest. The bear's eyes found hers across the 20 feet of torn earth and scattered pine needles. In that moment, Martha saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The bear wasn't just looking at her, she was pleading with her. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, a desperate communication that transcended species. The bear somehow understood that Martha represented hope, however slim, for her baby's survival. "Easy now," Martha heard herself saying in the same gentle voice she'd used with frightened third graders after playground accidents. "I see you, Mama. I see your babies." The bear stopped struggling against the python's coils. She seemed to be conserving her strength, placing some impossible trust in this elderly human woman who had no business being in this situation. The python, however, began to shift its attention toward Martha, its massive head weaving hypnotically as it assessed this new threat. Martha's mouth went dry as dust. She was 73 years old, arthritic, probably developing dementia, and armed with nothing more than a walking stick and 40 years of experience calming panicked children. The python could easily crush every bone in her body before she could even scream for help that would never come. But as she looked at those two cubs, one crying, one approaching its dying mother with the determined loyalty that only children possess, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt necessary. For the first time since Robert's death, someone needed her to be brave. The question wasn't whether she was strong enough to help. The question was whether she was strong enough to walk away. Martha's walking stick felt pathetically inadequate in her trembling hands as she faced down 12 feet of pure muscle and predatory instinct. The python's head, large as a dinner plate, swayed back and forth with hypnotic menace, its black eyes reflecting an intelligence far older and more patient than anything she'd ever encountered. But it was the bear's labored breathing that spurred Martha into action, each exhale weaker than the last, each desperate attempt to fill her lungs met by the snake's relentless constriction. "You let her go," Martha said firmly, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. It was the same tone she'd used with classroom bullies, though she'd never faced a bully quite this literal. "She's got babies to feed." The python, predictably, ignored her completely. But something extraordinary happened. The bear's eyes met hers again, and Martha could have sworn she saw the animal nod. Just slightly, barely perceptible, but unmistakably a gesture of acknowledgement, of permission. Martha circled slowly to the left, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She'd read somewhere that sudden motions triggered predatory responses in reptiles. The python tracked her movement but didn't release its death grip on the bear. Up close, Martha could see the toll the attack was taking, foam at the corners of the bear's mouth, her tongue beginning to protrude, the terrible blue tinge creeping around her gums. "Hold on, sweetheart," Martha whispered. "Just hold on a little longer." The memory hit her like a physical blow. Her grandson Danny, at age 4, trapped under the overturned canoe at the lake. She'd been babysitting that terrible afternoon, had turned away for just a moment to grab his life jacket. The sound of his desperate gasping when she'd finally lifted the fiberglass hull was identical to the bear's current struggle. Danny had lived, thank God, but the guilt had carved itself into Martha's bones and never left. Not this time, not on her watch. Martha studied the python's coils with the analytical mind that had once helped her solve classroom crises. The snake had wrapped itself around the bear's torso in 3 distinct loops: chest, midsection, and lower abdomen. The head end maintained its grip just behind the bear's front legs, while the tail end anchored itself around a nearby Douglas fir. It was a perfect killing machine. But Martha noticed something the reptile probably hadn't considered. It had positioned itself partially over a cluster of sharp granite rocks. She picked up the largest stone she could manage with her arthritic hands, about the size of a softball and twice as heavy as her old bones wanted to lift. The python was focused entirely on its victim now, confident that one elderly human posed no real threat. Martha raised the rock above her head, her shoulders screaming in protest, and brought it down hard on the snake's body where it curved over the sharpest edge of granite. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The python released the bear with a sound like escaping steam and whirled toward Martha with shocking speed. She stumbled backward, her hip catching on a root, and went down hard on the forest floor. The snake's massive head loomed over her, mouth gaping wide enough to reveal fangs that could punch through leather. But the bear was already moving. Even oxygen-starved and weakened, maternal instinct drove her to her feet faster than should have been possible. She caught the python behind its head with jaws that could crack walnuts and began shaking it like a terrier with a rat. The snake's body thrashed wildly, but it couldn't bring its coils to bear on this new angle of attack. Martha rolled away from the battle and scrambled to her feet, adrenaline making her feel 20 years younger. The two cubs had retreated to the edge of the clearing, making distressed, chittering sounds, but they stayed close enough to watch their mothers fight for survival. The python was powerful, but it had lost the advantage of surprise and position. The bear's powerful neck muscles kept its head pinned, while her claws raked deep furrows along its body. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the snake went limp. The bear held on for another few seconds, then released it and stepped back, her sides heaving. Martha and the bear stared at each other across the churned earth of the clearing. Blood trickled from puncture wounds where the python's teeth had found purchase, and the bear swayed slightly on her feet. But she was alive, and more importantly, her cubs were safe. "Good girl," Martha said softly. "You're one hell of a mother." The bear huffed once, a sound that Martha chose to interpret as agreement, then turned to nuzzle her cubs. They immediately began trying to nurse, though the larger one seemed more interested in investigating the strange human who had somehow helped save their mother. Martha's legs suddenly felt like overcooked pasta. She sat down hard on a convenient log, her whole body shaking with delayed shock. She'd actually done it. At 73 years old, with arthritis and possible dementia and a heart that skipped beats when she climbed stairs too fast, she'd helped save a life. 3 lives, actually. But as the adrenaline faded, practical concerns crept back in. The python, while wounded, wasn't dead. She could see it moving sluggishly in the underbrush where it had retreated. The bear needed medical attention for her wounds, and Martha herself was probably going to be in serious trouble when Sarah found out about this little adventure. That's when she noticed something glinting in the afternoon sunlight, a small metal tag partially buried under the leaves where the python had thrashed. Martha picked it up and felt her blood turn to ice water. "Property of Wilderness Research Institute," she read aloud. "Subject number 47. This wasn't a wild python that had somehow found its way to Oregon. Someone had put it here deliberately. Someone had trained it to kill bears. The metal tag felt cold and alien in Martha's palm, its clinical numbering system a stark contrast to the raw wildness surrounding her. Subject number 47 implied there were at least 46 others, and the thought made her stomach lurch. She looked up to find the bear watching her with what seemed like knowing intelligence, as if the animal understood that this small piece of metal represented something far more sinister than a random predator attack. "Someone did this to you on purpose, didn't they, sweetheart?" Martha whispered. The bear's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She began backing away from Martha, her cubs pressed close to her sides, making low warning sounds deep in her throat. But her eyes never left Martha's face, and there was something almost human in their expression. Not fear of Martha herself, but fear of what Martha represented. The bear had learned to associate humans with danger, with betrayal, with the kind of cruelty that set pythons loose in peaceful forests. Martha's heart clenched as she recognized the look. She'd seen it in her classroom over the years. Children who'd been hurt so badly by adults that they couldn't trust kindness anymore, who flinched away from helping hands because those same hands had caused them pain before. "No, honey, wait," Martha said, rising slowly from the log. "I'm not with them. I don't even know who them is." But the bear continued her retreat, and Martha realized with growing horror that she was losing the most important connection she'd made in years. The creature who had trusted her enough to accept help was now seeing her as part of whatever system had put her family in danger. The sound of ATV engines echoed through the forest, still distant but growing closer. The bear heard them too, and her retreat became more urgent. She nudged her cubs toward a game trail that led deeper into the wilderness, away from the approaching mechanical sounds. The larger cub lingered, looking back at Martha with what seemed like confusion, but his mother's insistent grunting pulled him away. Martha watched them disappear into the green shadows, feeling more alone than she had since Robert's funeral. The ATVs were getting closer, and she suddenly understood why the bear had been so afraid. Whoever was coming wasn't here to help. They were here to clean up their mess, to retrieve their property, and probably to eliminate any witnesses who might ask uncomfortable questions. She pocketed the metal tag and began walking quickly back toward the main trail, trying to look like nothing more than a confused elderly woman who'd gotten turned around in the woods. Her mind raced as she replayed the scene in the clearing. The python hadn't been hunting for food. It had been following some kind of programming, targeting bears specifically. And the Wilderness Research Institute tag suggested this was sanctioned by people with official credentials and funding. The first ATV rounded the bend just as Martha reached the main trail. The rider wore military-style camouflage and a radio headset, and when he saw her, his hand moved instinctively toward something on his belt that might have been a weapon. "Ma'am, you need to clear this area immediately," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected instant compliance. "We've had reports of dangerous wildlife activity." Dangerous wildlife? Martha tried to look appropriately concerned and helpless. "Oh my, I was just out for my daily walk. Should I be worried?" "The area is being secured for public safety. I'll need to escort you back to the parking area." Martha nodded and began walking beside the ATV, but her mind was cataloging details. And the man's equipment was expensive and professional, not the gear of weekend hunters or even regular Forest Service personnel. His radio crackled with coded communications about containment and asset recovery. And when they passed the turnoff toward the clearing where she'd fought the python, she caught a glimpse of more riders heading in that direction. At the parking area, Martha thanked the man politely and climbed into her ancient Honda Civic. But instead of driving home, she circled back on a logging road she'd known since her teaching days, when she'd brought classes out here for nature walks. The road was overgrown and barely passable, but it would get her to the ridge overlooking the clearing without using the main trail. What she saw from her hiding spot among the fir trees made her blood run cold. At least 6 men in tactical gear were combing through the area where she'd fought the python. They had tracking equipment, tranquilizer weapons, and what looked like portable cages. One of them was speaking into a radio, and Martha caught fragments of his transmission on the wind. "No sign of the subjects. Blood trail leads north. Deploying Containment Protocol 7. Subjects. Plural. They weren't just looking for the python, they were hunting the bear family she'd helped save." Martha's hands shook as she pulled out her cell phone. Still no signal, but she had to try something. The bears needed a warning, needed to get farther away before these men tracked them down. But how do you warn wild animals about human hunters? How do you tell a bear mother that the people she already feared were coming for her children? The answer came to her with startling clarity. She couldn't warn them directly, but she could buy them time. She could be the distraction these hunters didn't expect. Martha climbed back into her car and drove to the nearest point where she had cell service, about 2 miles down the mountain road. Her first call was to Tommy Richardson at the ranger station. "Tommy, it's Martha Anderson. I need you to listen carefully because I don't have much time." "Mrs. Anderson, are you all right? You sound—" "I'm fine, but there are armed men in the forest conducting some kind of illegal operation. They're hunting bears with tranquilizer weapons, and they have government-looking credentials, something called the Wilderness Research Institute." There was a long pause. "Mrs. Anderson, that doesn't sound right. The WRI is a legitimate organization. Dr. Morrison runs their local research station. Martha's world tilted sideways. Dr. Morrison, James Morrison, her oldest friend, the man who'd baptized her grandson, who'd held her hand at Robert's funeral, the man she'd trusted with her deepest fears about growing old and useless. Tommy, I need you to contact the state wildlife authorities. Tell them about the armed men, about the tranquilizer weapons, and tell them— She hesitated, knowing how this would sound. Tell them there's a family of black bears in danger and that someone has been using pythons to hunt them. Pythons? Mrs. Anderson, there aren't any pythons native to Oregon. I know that, Tommy. That's exactly the point. Her second call was the hardest one she'd ever made. Sarah's number rang 4 times before going to voicemail, the way it always did when Martha called. But this time, Martha didn't hang up after the beep. Sarah, it's your mother. I know you're probably busy, and I know you think I'm losing my mind, but I need you to listen to this whole message. I'm in trouble, sweetheart. Real trouble. There are people doing terrible things to animals in our forest, and I've gotten myself involved in something dangerous. If anything happens to me, I need you to know that I love you, and I'm sorry we fought. I'm sorry I've been such a burden, but I'm not sorry for what I'm about to do, because sometimes an old woman has to take a stand for what's right. She ended the call and sat in her car for a moment, looking out at the forest that had been her refuge for 43 years. The bears were out there somewhere, probably moving as fast as they could with 2 cubs to protect. The armed men were tracking them with professional equipment and military precision, and Martha was about to do something that would either save 3 innocent lives or get herself killed in the process. She drove back toward the research station, the metal tag burning like a coal in her pocket. It was time to have a conversation with Dr. James Morrison about what exactly he'd been researching in her forest. And if James was really behind this horror, then Martha was about to learn just how much a lifetime of trust was worth when measured against the price of a mother's love. The Honda's engine coughed as she turned onto the gravel road leading to the WRI facility, hidden among the trees like a secret that had been festering for too long. Martha had always known that the most dangerous predators walked on 2 legs, but she'd never expected to find one wearing the face of a friend. The Wilderness Research Institute sat in a cleared meadow like a wound in the forest, its modern glass and steel architecture jarringly out of place among the ancient firs. Martha had driven past the entrance countless times over the years, always assuming it was some benign government facility studying migration patterns or soil composition. She'd never imagined it as the headquarters for something that would release trained killers into her beloved woods. Security cameras tracked her ancient Honda as she pulled into the visitor parking area. The lot was nearly empty except for several black SUVs with government plates and what looked like a military transport vehicle. Martha's stomach churned as she realized the scope of whatever operation was being conducted here. This wasn't some rogue researcher with a few exotic pets. This was organized, funded, and official. The lobby was sterile and intimidating, all polished concrete and brushed steel. A young receptionist with dead eyes and a practiced smile looked up from her computer terminal as Martha approached the desk. "I'm here to see Dr. Morrison," Martha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's about his research project." "Do you have an appointment?" "Tell him Martha Anderson is here. Tell him it's about subject number 47. The receptionist's smile faltered slightly, and she picked up her phone with movements that seemed suddenly more alert. Martha couldn't hear the conversation, but she watched the young woman's expression shift from routine politeness to something like concern. When she hung up, her smile was completely gone. "Dr. Morrison will see you immediately. Please follow the yellow line to Laboratory C." The yellow line led Martha through corridors that felt more like a hospital than a research facility. She passed doors marked with ominous warnings about authorized personnel only and biological hazards. Through one partially open door, she glimpsed what looked like veterinary examination tables surrounded by monitors and IV stands. The antiseptic smell of the place reminded her unpleasantly of Robert's final weeks in the cancer ward. Laboratory C turned out to be an office overlooking what appeared to be an animal holding facility. Through the large windows, Martha could see rows of enclosures, most of them empty, but some containing shapes that moved with the fluid grace of large snakes. Her blood turned to ice water as she realized she was looking at a breeding and training facility for pythons. Martha! She turned to find James Morrison standing in the doorway, and for a moment she barely recognized him. The man she'd known for 45 years, who'd taught Sunday school with patience and kindness, who'd delivered countless forest animals to safety, looked aged beyond his 70 years. His eyes were hollow, his face drawn with lines of exhaustion and something that might have been guilt. "Hello, James," she said quietly. "We need to talk." He closed the door behind him and gestured toward a chair, but Martha remained standing. The metal tag felt heavy in her pocket, but she didn't pull it out yet. She wanted to hear his explanation first, wanted to understand how the man who'd once spent an entire night helping her search for a lost classroom pet had become someone who set deadly snakes loose on bear families. "You look tired," she said finally. James ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Eleanor's dying, Martha. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months, and that was 8 months ago." Martha's anger wavered despite herself. Eleanor Wilson had been one of her closest friends, the woman who'd brought her casseroles after Robert's death, and who'd listened without judgment when Martha confessed her fears about growing old alone. "James, I'm so sorry. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because what was I supposed to say? That I was watching the love of my life waste away while I stood by helpless. That every experimental treatment we tried failed, every clinical trial rejected her, every hope turned to ash." His voice cracked with raw pain. "Do you know what it's like to watch someone you've loved for 47 years disappear piece by piece?" Martha did know, but she sensed this wasn't the time to mention Robert's long decline. "What does Eleanor's illness have to do with releasing pythons in the forest?" James walked to the window overlooking the snake enclosures, his shoulders sagging with defeat. "Bear bile, Martha. Specifically, bile from bears under extreme stress. Traditional Chinese medicine has used it for centuries to treat liver conditions, but recent research suggests it might have applications for pancreatic cancer as well. The problem is that stress hormones are the key. The bile has to be harvested from bears experiencing maximum fear and pain." Martha felt sick. "You're torturing bears to make medicine for Eleanor." "I'm trying to save my wife," James snapped, then seemed to deflate again. "The pythons don't kill them quickly. They create the exact physiological response we need: prolonged terror, elevated stress hormones, the right chemical composition in the bile. It's the only thing that's shown any promise for Eleanor's particular cancer variant." "And you didn't think to mention this to me? Your oldest friend? The woman who's lived in these woods for 43 years? James turned back to her and she saw tears in his eyes. "Because I knew you'd try to stop me. And I can't let you do that, Martha." "I can't let anyone do that. Eleanor has maybe 2 weeks left and we're so close to a breakthrough." Martha pulled the metal tag from her pocket and set it on his desk. "Subject number 47 nearly killed a mother bear with 2 cubs today. I stopped it." The color drained from James's face. "You... what?" "I fought a 12-foot python with a walking stick and a rock, James. A 73-year-old woman with arthritis saved a bear family while your trained killer tried to torture a mother to death in front of her babies." Martha's voice rose with anger. "That bear looked at me with more trust and gratitude than I've seen from another human being in years. She let me touch her cubs, James. Do you understand what that means? Martha, you don't understand the science. I understand that you've become someone I don't recognize. The James Morrison I knew would have spent his last dollar trying to save that bear family, not hunting them with snakes. James slumped into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. Eleanor doesn't know. She thinks I'm working on a conventional research project. If she knew what I was doing to save her, he looked up at Martha with desperate eyes. She'd rather die than live with this on her conscience. Then why are you doing it? Because I can't live without her, Martha. I've never had to face a world that doesn't include Eleanor Wilson, and I'm not brave enough to start now. Martha felt her anger dissolving into something more complicated. Pity mixed with understanding and a terrible sadness for what her friend had become. She thought about the bear mother's eyes, the trust and gratitude in that wild gaze, and then she thought about Eleanor's gentle hands making strawberry jam every summer for 40 years. "Where is she now?" Martha asked. "At home." She wanted to spend her last days in her own garden, with her own things around her. "Does she know you're here?" James shook his head. "I told her I was helping with a migration study. She's sleeping most of the time now. The pain medication makes her drowsy." Martha made a decision that would change everything. "Take me to her." "Martha, I can't." "You can, and you will. Because Eleanor deserves to know what you're doing in her name, and she deserves to make her own choice about whether it's worth it." Martha leaned forward, her voice gentle but implacable. "And because the bear family you're hunting saved my life today, and I owe them the chance to save Eleanor's soul." James stared at her for a long moment, then slowly reached for his car keys. "The research team will continue the hunt whether I'm here or not." "Then we'd better hurry." As they left the laboratory, Martha caught a glimpse of movement in one of the outdoor enclosures. A massive python, easily 15 feet long, lifted its head to watch them pass. Its eyes were the same cold intelligence she'd seen in the forest, and she shuddered to think how many more subjects were being trained in this sterile facility. But for now, her focus was on Eleanor Wilson, a dying woman who deserved to know that her husband's love had transformed into something monstrous, and who might be the only person left who could call him back from the abyss he'd fallen into. The drive to the Wilson house would take 20 minutes. Martha could only hope that would be enough time to save a friendship, a marriage, and a bear family that had already suffered too much at the hands of desperate humans. Eleanor Wilson lay propped against a mountain of pillows in the hospital bed that now dominated her living room, her once robust frame diminished to bird-like fragility. The woman who had organized church potlucks for 30 years and maintained the most spectacular garden in 3 counties was barely recognizable beneath the yellow pallor of advancing cancer. But her eyes, those same bright blue eyes that had sparkled with mischief during countless coffee conversations with Martha, were still alert and knowing. "Martha Anderson," Eleanor said softly, her voice paper-thin but warm with genuine pleasure. "What a wonderful surprise. James told me you'd been having some difficult days lately." Martha shot a sharp look at James, who had the grace to appear ashamed. "Did he now? And what exactly did my dear friend tell you about my difficult days?" "Just that you've been struggling with some memory issues. He's been worried about you hiking alone in the forest." Eleanor reached out with a hand that felt like tissue paper, and Martha grasped it gently. "Though looking at you now, you seem sharp as ever to me." "Eleanor, there's something James hasn't told you. Something important." Martha pulled a chair close to the bedside while James remained standing by the window, his face a mask of dread. "About what he's really been doing at that research facility." Eleanor's eyes shifted between Martha and her husband, and Martha could see the intelligence there despite the medication and pain. "James, what is Martha talking about?" James opened his mouth, but no words came. Martha had never seen her confident, articulate friend look so broken, so utterly defeated. She realized that she would have to be the one to speak the truth that would either save or destroy what remained of the Wilson marriage. "Eleanor, honey, James has been trying to save your life. But the methods he's chosen," Martha took a deep breath. "He's been capturing and torturing wild bears to harvest their bile for experimental cancer treatment." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's hand went slack in Martha's grasp, and her face cycled through expressions of disbelief, horror, and finally, a crushing sadness that seemed to age her another decade in seconds. "Is this true?" she whispered, looking at her husband. James finally found his voice, though it came out as a broken rasp. "Elle, I was desperate. The doctors said there was nothing left to try. But there's research suggesting that bear bile under stress conditions can combat pancreatic cancer in ways that conventional medicine—" "Stop!" Eleanor's voice, though weak, carried absolute authority. "James Morrison, look at me and tell me you haven't been hurting innocent animals because you can't accept that I'm dying." "I can't accept it," James said, tears streaming down his face. "I can't live in a world without you, Elle. I can't face 40 more years of waking up alone, of eating dinner by myself, of having no one to tell about my day. So yes, I've done terrible things, unforgivable things, because losing you is worse than losing my soul." Eleanor closed her eyes for a long moment, and Martha could see her lips moving in what might have been prayer. When she opened them again, there was a strength there that transcended her physical frailty. "Bring me my garden journal," she said quietly. James retrieved a worn leather notebook from the bedside table, confusion evident on his face. Eleanor opened it with shaking hands and found the page she was looking for. "Last spring, do you remember the bear that got into our garbage cans?" she asked Martha. Martha nodded. "Big female with 2 cubs. You were so excited to see them." "I was excited because she wasn't afraid of us. She let her babies play in our yard while she watched." "James wanted to call animal control, but I convinced him to just secure the garbage better." Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "For 3 weeks, that little family visited us every evening. I started leaving apples out for them, and the mother began bringing her cubs closer to the house each day." She turned a page in the journal, revealing detailed sketches of the bear family. "I drew pictures of them, wrote down their behaviors, documented how the cubs learned to follow their mother's example in trusting us. It was the most magical thing I'd ever experienced. Wild creatures choosing to share their lives with us." Martha felt her throat tighten as she recognized the bears in Eleanor's careful drawings. The distinctive white patch on the mother's chest, the slightly smaller size of one cub compared to the other. "Eleanor, that was Luna and her babies." "Luna." Eleanor smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "You named her." "How do you know it was the same family?" "Because I met them today, in the forest. Luna was being attacked by one of James's pythons, and I helped save her." Martha's voice broke. "She looked at me with the same trust you describe in your journal, Eleanor. She let me touch her cubs after I freed her from that snake." Eleanor turned to her husband with an expression that combined infinite love with absolute disappointment. "James, you've been torturing the animals that brought me the greatest joy of my final year. The mother bear who trusted us enough to share her children with us. You've been hunting her with snakes." James collapsed into a chair as if his legs could no longer support him. "Elle, I didn't know. I couldn't have known." "But you should have asked me," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength despite her physical weakness. "You should have asked me if I wanted to live with the blood of innocent creatures on my hands. You should have asked me if a few extra months of life would be worth an eternity of guilt." Martha watched her oldest friends face the deepest crisis of their 47-year marriage, feeling like an intruder, but knowing her presence was necessary. Someone needed to witness this moment, needed to ensure that the truth was fully spoken and heard. "What would you have said?" James asked, his voice barely audible. "If I had asked?" Eleanor reached for his hand, and he grasped it like a lifeline. "I would have said that I've lived a beautiful life. I've been married to a good man, raised wonderful children, seen my grandchildren grow up happy and healthy. I've had more love and joy than any one person deserves." She paused, gathering strength. "And I would have said that I'd rather die as the woman you fell in love with than live as someone who causes suffering to innocent creatures. But No, James, listen to me. Really listen." Eleanor struggled to sit up straighter, and Martha helped adjust her pillows. "The bear bile might extend my life by a few weeks or months, but what kind of life would that be? Every day haunted by the knowledge that bears were tortured so I could breathe a little longer. Every sunset tainted by the memory of their suffering." She turned to Martha. "You said Luna looked at you with trust. After everything humans have done to her, she still chose to trust you when you tried to help her? That's the kind of grace I want to take with me when I go. Not the bitterness of knowing I caused pain to creatures capable of such forgiveness." James was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that shook his entire frame. "I can't lose you, Elle. I don't know how to be in this world without you." "Oh, my darling man," Eleanor whispered, stroking his hair with trembling fingers. "You're not losing me." "I'll always be with you, in the garden we planted together, in the memories we made, in the kindness you show to every creature that crosses your path. But this version of you, this man who hurts innocent animals out of fear, this isn't the James Morrison I married. This isn't the man I want to leave behind." Martha felt tears streaming down her own cheeks as she watched two people who had loved each other for nearly 5 decades find their way back to each other across an abyss of pain and desperation. But outside, darkness was falling, and somewhere in the forest, Luna and her cubs were still being hunted by men with tranquilizer guns in cages. "James," Martha said gently, "it's not too late to stop this. You can call off the hunt, shut down the facility, become the man Eleanor remembers again." Eleanor squeezed her husband's hand. "Please, James, let me die knowing that Luna and her babies are safe. Let that be your gift to me. Not a few more painful weeks, but the peace of knowing you chose love over fear." James Morrison reached for his phone with hands that shook like autumn leaves. But before he could dial, the sound of vehicles approaching made all 3 of them freeze. Through the living room window, Martha could see the headlights of multiple ATVs cutting through the gathering dusk, followed by what looked like a military transport truck. The convoy pulled into the Wilsons' circular driveway with the precision of a tactical operation. "They followed us," James whispered, his face going ashen. "The research team. They must have tracking on the facility vehicles." Eleanor struggled to sit up higher in her bed, her eyes sharp despite the pain medication. "James, what exactly have you gotten yourself involved with?" Before he could answer, the front door burst open without so much as a knock. 3 men in tactical gear entered the living room like they owned it, their leader a tall, cold-eyed man in his 50s who carried himself with military bearing. Martha recognized him as the head of security from the research facility. "Dr. Morrison," the man said, his voice clipped and professional, "you left your post without authorization during an active containment operation. That's a violation of your contract and a breach of security protocol." "Colonel Hayes," James said, rising from his chair with what dignity he could muster. "I'm terminating my involvement with the project, effective immediately." Hayes's laugh was as cold as winter rain. "I'm afraid that's not how this works, Doctor. You've seen too much, know too much, and frankly, you're too emotionally compromised to be trusted with operational security." His eyes shifted to Martha and Eleanor. "As are your friends here." Martha felt ice forming in her veins as she realized they weren't just witnesses to James's crimes, They had become loose ends that needed tying up. What are you saying? I'm saying that Mrs. Anderson's little adventure in the forest today has created some complications. She interfered with a sanctioned research operation, destroyed valuable government property, and now she's privy to classified information. Hayes stepped closer to Martha, his presence radiating barely contained violence. The same goes for Mrs. Wilson. Too many people know about our work now. Eleanor's voice, though weak, carried the same steel that had once managed a classroom full of rebellious teenagers. Young man, I don't know who you think you are, but you will not come into my home and threaten my friends. Hayes smiled, and the expression was more frightening than his anger had been. Mrs. Wilson, your home sits on approximately 40 acres of prime research territory. The Wilderness Research Institute has been looking to expand its operations, and your property would be perfect for our needs. The fact that you won't be needing it much longer makes the acquisition process much simpler. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Martha realized that James hadn't just been a researcher, he'd been a pawn in something much larger and more sinister. You've been planning this all along. Eleanor's cancer, James's desperation, you used it all to get access to this area. Mrs. Anderson is more perceptive than her age might suggest, Hayes said approvingly. Yes, we've been monitoring the Wilson property for months. When Mrs. Wilson's diagnosis became terminal, it created the perfect opportunity. Dr. Morrison's emotional state made him extremely malleable, and his veterinary expertise was genuinely useful for our research. James's face had gone white with understanding and horror. You're saying Eleanor's treatment, the experimental drugs, the hope you gave me, none of it was real? Oh, the research is quite real, Dr. Morrison. Bear bile harvested under extreme stress conditions does show promise for certain types of cancer. But Mrs. Wilson's particular variant? Hayes shrugged with casual cruelty. She was never a viable candidate. Her condition is too advanced, her system too compromised. We simply allowed you to believe otherwise to ensure your cooperation. Eleanor made a sound that was half gasp, half sob, and Martha felt rage building in her chest like a forest fire. These men hadn't just used James's love against him. They had tormented a dying woman with false hope while destroying the very creatures that had brought her joy in her final months. You bastards, Martha said, her voice carrying 40 years of classroom authority. You absolute bastards. Hayes turned his attention back to her with renewed interest. Which brings us to the current problem. The subjects you helped escape this afternoon are worth approximately $2 million in research investment. The female, in particular, has been conditioned for optimal stress response. Losing her would set our project back by months. Good, Martha said fiercely. I hope Luna and her cubs are halfway to Canada by now. Luna? Hayes consulted a tablet one of his men handed him. Ah, yes. Subject number 23. Actually, Mrs. Anderson, they're not halfway to Canada. Our tracking indicates they're approximately 2 miles northeast of here, moving slowly due to the cubs' limited endurance. We'll have them back in containment within the hour. Martha's heart sank. She had helped Luna escape one trap only to lead her into another. The bear mother who had shown such trust and gratitude was about to be recaptured, and this time there would be no escape. However, Hayes continued, their recovery has been complicated by your interference. The female now associates humans with rescue rather than threat. She's lost her natural fear response, which makes her useless for our research purposes. What does that mean? James asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. It means subject number 23 will be terminated along with her offspring. We'll harvest what we can for analysis and start fresh with new subjects. Hayes looked directly at Martha as he spoke, clearly enjoying the pain his words caused. Your heroic rescue this afternoon has condemned them to death, Mrs. Anderson. I hope the momentary satisfaction was worth it." Eleanor's voice cut through the room like a blade. "James Morrison, you listen to me very carefully. These men are not your colleagues. They are not your friends. They are predators who used your love for me to turn you into something monstrous. Despite her weakness, she managed to push herself up to a sitting position. But you have one chance to redeem yourself. One chance to become the man I married again. Elle, what can I do? They have weapons, vehicles, tracking equipment. You can choose, Eleanor said simply. You can choose to let fear control you, or you can choose to fight for something good. You can choose to let Luna die for nothing, or you can choose to save her the way she saved Martha. Hayes was watching this exchange with amused detachment, clearly confident that 3 elderly civilians posed no threat to his operation. But he hadn't spent 40 years observing human nature the way Martha had. He didn't recognize the moment when desperate people stopped being victims and started being dangerous. Martha caught James's eye and saw something shifting there, the spark of the man Eleanor had fallen in love with decades ago. She thought about Luna's trust, about the cubs following their mother through dangerous territory, about the way wild creatures sometimes understood love better than the humans who considered themselves superior. "James," Martha said quietly, "do you still have the emergency wildlife alert system from your veterinary days?" A slow smile spread across James's face, the first genuine expression Martha had seen from him all day. "The one that reaches every ranger station, police department, and media outlet in 3 counties? Yes, I still have access to those codes." Hayes stepped forward, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Dr. Morrison, I strongly advise against—" But James was already moving toward the emergency radio setup in Eleanor's craft room, Martha right behind him. They had perhaps seconds before Hayes and his men stopped them, but sometimes seconds were enough to change everything. As James's fingers flew over the radio controls, activating an emergency broadcast that would bring every law enforcement officer in the region to their location, Martha thought about Luna somewhere in the dark forest, protecting her cubs with the same fierce determination that had driven James to make terrible choices and Eleanor to face death with grace. The difference was that Luna's love created life and safety for her children. Now it was time for the humans to learn what love really meant. The emergency broadcast crackled across 3 counties like wildfire, James's veterinary credentials lending authority to words that would otherwise sound like the ravings of desperate people. "This is Dr. James Morrison, DVM, requesting immediate law enforcement response to 1247 Pine Ridge Road. Armed individuals conducting illegal wildlife operations. Officer safety threatened. Multiple civilians in immediate danger." Hayes lunged toward the radio, but Martha had positioned herself between him and the equipment with the stubborn determination of a woman who had spent 4 decades managing chaos. "You'll have to go through me," she said, spreading her arms wide. "That can be arranged," Hayes replied coldly, his hand moving to his sidearm. But the sound of sirens was already rising in the distance. First one, then several, growing closer with each passing second. Hayes cursed fluently and spoke rapidly into his headset, clearly coordinating with his team members who were still hunting Luna in the forest. Eleanor's voice cut through the tension from her bed. "You know what I regret most about dying, James? That I won't get to see how this story ends. But I have a feeling it's going to be something beautiful." The first patrol car skidded into the driveway with lights blazing, followed quickly by 2 more. Martha recognized Tommy Richardson behind the wheel of the lead vehicle, his young face set with grim determination. Behind him came Deputy Maria Santos, and to Martha's surprise, her daughter Sarah in her own car. "Mom!" Sarah burst through the front door, her face streaked with tears. "I got your message and drove straight here. I called every police station between Portland and here." "What's happening?" Martha found herself wrapped in her daughter's arms for the first time in 8 months, and the feeling was like coming home after a long journey through cold country. "Sarah, honey, there's so much to explain. Hands where we can see them." Tommy's voice carried an authority Martha had never heard from the young ranger before. He and Deputy Santos had their weapons drawn, trained on Hayes and his men. "Everyone step away from the civilians." Hayes remained calm, pulling out a leather wallet that contained official-looking credentials. "Officer, I'm Colonel Hayes with the Department of Interior Research Division. These people have interfered with a classified wildlife management operation." Tommy examined the credentials but didn't lower his weapon. "Sir, I'm going to need you to contact your superiors while we sort this out. Mrs. Anderson, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Tommy." "But there's a bear family in the forest that won't be if we don't stop these men." Martha quickly explained about Luna, the pythons, the illegal research facility, and the tracking team still hunting in the woods. Deputy Santos was already on her radio, requesting backup and wildlife authorities. But Martha knew that bureaucracy moved slowly and Luna didn't have time for proper channels and jurisdictional disputes. "James," Eleanor called weakly from her bed. "The old logging road behind our property connects to the trail system. If Luna is moving northeast like they said, she'll have to cross Miller's Creek. There's only one safe crossing point with cubs that small." Martha understood immediately. "The fallen log bridge near the old ranger cabin. We could reach it faster on foot than their ATVs could navigate the undergrowth." Sarah gripped her mother's arm. "Mom, you're not seriously thinking of going back out there. You're 73 years old. And Luna is a wild bear with 2 babies who trusted me enough to let me save her life," Martha replied. "I won't abandon her now." Hayes was speaking urgently into his radio, clearly frustrated by the arrival of law enforcement. "Alpha Team, expedite subject recovery. Local authorities are compromising the operation. Terminate if necessary and extract immediately." The words, "terminate if necessary," galvanized everyone in the room. Tommy stepped forward, his voice carrying new steel. "Sir, you just authorized lethal force against protected wildlife. I'm placing you under arrest pending investigation." But Hayes and his men were already moving toward the back door, using the confusion to slip away into the darkness. Martha heard ATVs starting up behind the house and knew they were racing against time to reach Luna first. "Tommy, take the main road to the research facility," Martha said urgently. "Sarah, call the state wildlife authorities and tell them to bring tranquilizer equipment for aggressive humans, not animals." She looked at her daughter with fierce love. "And trust me, honey. Trust that your old mother knows what she's doing." James was already grabbing flashlights and his emergency veterinary kit. "I know those woods better than anyone. I can guide us to Miller's Creek." Eleanor struggled to reach her bedside table, pulling out a small silver whistle. "James, take this. It's the one I used to call the bears to our yard. If Luna hears it, she'll know it means safety." Martha kissed Eleanor's forehead gently. "You rest now, dear friend. When we get back, I want to hear more stories about Luna's visits to your garden." "Bring her home safe," Eleanor whispered. "Bring them all home safe." The forest at night was a different world than the peaceful woods Martha hiked during daylight hours. Shadows shifted and danced in the beam of their flashlights, and every sound seemed amplified by darkness and adrenaline. James moved with surprising agility for a man his age, following game trails he'd walked during decades of veterinary calls to injured wildlife. They could hear the distant roar of ATV engines, growing closer but still fighting the thick underbrush that made vehicular pursuit difficult. Martha's arthritic knees protested every step, but the image of Luna's trusting eyes kept her moving forward. "There," James whispered, pointing ahead to where Miller's Creek reflected starlight between the trees. "The crossing is just around that bend." They reached the fallen log just as Luna emerged from the opposite bank. her 2 cubs close behind her. Even in the dim light, Martha could see the bear's exhaustion. She'd been moving for hours with young cubs, probably without stopping to rest or feed. Luna saw them and froze, her massive head swinging back and forth as she scented the air. For a terrifying moment, Martha thought the bear might flee back into the forest where Hayes's men were waiting. But then James raised Eleanor's silver whistle to his lips and blew a soft, warbling note. Luna's entire posture changed. Her ears pricked forward, and she made a soft, chuffing sound that Martha had learned meant recognition and relief. The bear began crossing the log bridge, her cubs following with the unquestioning trust that only children possess. The sound of approaching ATVs grew louder, and flashlight beams began probing through the trees behind Luna. Hayes's voice carried across the water. "Subjects located, moving to intercept." Martha stepped into the open, positioning herself between the approaching vehicles and the bear family. "Luna, bring your babies here. Come to me, sweetheart." Luna didn't hesitate. She hurried across the remaining distance and, in a moment that would stay with Martha for the rest of her life, gently nuzzled her hand before positioning herself and her cubs behind the elderly woman. The message was clear. Luna was choosing to trust human protection over wild flight. James stood beside Martha, his veterinary training overcoming his fear as he assessed the cubs for signs of exhaustion or injury. "They're tired but healthy," he reported. "But we need to get them somewhere safe." The ATV lights were getting closer, but other sounds were joining them now. The deeper rumble of official vehicles, the voices of law enforcement officers coordinating their response. Tommy Richardson's voice echoed across the forest through a bullhorn. "This is the authorities. All personnel conducting unauthorized activities in this forest are ordered to cease operations and report to the nearest officer immediately." Martha felt Luna's warm breath on her neck as the great bear stood protectively over her cubs. In that moment, with sirens wailing in the distance and rescue finally arriving, Martha understood something profound about the nature of family. Sometimes the bonds that mattered most weren't the ones you were born with, but the ones you chose to honor when it mattered most. Luna had chosen to trust her. Now it was time to prove that trust had been well placed. 6 months after that terrifying night at Miller's Creek, Martha Anderson sat on her back porch watching Luna teach her now yearling cubs how to safely approach the feeding station James had built at the edge of the property. The research facility had been shut down permanently. Hayes and his team faced federal charges for wildlife trafficking, and the Wilson property had been designated as Oregon's first human-wildlife sanctuary, a place where healing could happen for both species. Eleanor had lived to see Luna's cubs take their first independent steps into the world, passing away peacefully in her sleep just as the spring wildflowers began blooming in the garden she'd tended for 47 years. Her final words to James had been about gratitude, not for the extra months the experimental treatments might have given her, but for the privilege of witnessing Martha and Luna's extraordinary friendship. "She changed everything, didn't she?" Sarah said, settling into the chair beside her mother with 2 cups of coffee. Sarah had moved back to Oregon after the events in the forest, taking early retirement from her Portland law firm to help manage the sanctuary. The 8 months of silence between them felt like ancient history now, dissolved by the simple recognition that some things mattered more than old arguments. Martha nodded, watching Luna demonstrate to her cubs how to accept the specially formulated honey cakes James prepared each morning. "She taught me that love doesn't diminish when you share it. It multiplies. I spent so much time feeling useless, feeling like I was just taking up space in a world that had moved on without me. And now? Now I know that sometimes the most important work of your life doesn't begin until you think it's over." Martha smiled as the smaller cub, still cautious but curious, approached within 10 feet of the porch. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the National Geographic Society called yesterday. They want to do a full documentary about the sanctuary, about the science of interspecies healing relationships. The sanctuary had become something neither Martha nor James could have imagined in those dark early days. What started as a safe haven for Luna's family had evolved into a revolutionary research facility where scientists studied the therapeutic benefits of human-animal bonds. Martha had become the first certified wildlife liaison specialist, a fancy title for what amounted to being Luna's translator and advocate. The work was harder than anything she'd done as a teacher, requiring physical stamina she'd thought was long gone and emotional resilience she'd forgotten she possessed. But every morning when Luna appeared at the edge of the clearing, sometimes bringing other bears who needed help or healing, Martha felt a sense of purpose that made her 74-year-old bones feel strong again. "James looks better," Sarah observed, watching the veterinarian-turned-sanctuary director emerge from the research station with his daily clipboard of observations. The guilt and desperation that had aged him so dramatically during Eleanor's illness had been replaced by something Martha recognized as redemption. He'd channeled his grief into creating the most comprehensive wildlife rehabilitation program in the Pacific Northwest. Eleanor always said that the best way to honor someone's memory was to become the person they believed you could be, Martha replied. James is finally living up to Eleanor's faith in him. The sanctuary hosted visitors from around the world now, researchers, conservationists, and families who came to witness the daily miracle of wild bears choosing to interact peacefully with humans. But the most meaningful visitors were the elderly people who came seeking what Martha had found here, proof that their lives still had chapters left to write. Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old widow from San Francisco, had spent 3 weeks at the sanctuary learning to communicate with a family of raccoons that had taken up residence near the visitor center. Mr. Patterson, a 79-year-old former executive, had discovered an unexpected gift for calming injured birds during their rehabilitation process. Each success story added another layer to what the media had dubbed the Luna Effect, the documented therapeutic benefits of purposeful human-animal relationships. "You know what I learned from all this?" Martha said, watching Luna's cubs play wrestle near the creek. "I spent so many years afraid of becoming a burden, afraid of losing my independence, afraid of being forgotten. But Luna never saw me as old or weak or irrelevant. She saw me as someone who could help, someone who mattered." "She wasn't wrong," Sarah said softly. "Neither were you, honey. You were right to worry about me living alone, about my safety, about the memory issues, but you were wrong about the solution." Martha reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I didn't need to be taken care of. I needed to take care of something that mattered." The afternoon light was beginning to slant through the Douglas firs, painting everything in shades of gold that reminded Martha of honey. Luna rose from her resting spot and began the slow walk back toward the deep forest where she and her family spent their nights. But before disappearing into the trees, she stopped and looked back at Martha, a daily ritual that never failed to fill the elderly woman's heart with warmth. Martha raised her hand in their customary farewell wave, and Luna's ears pricked forward in acknowledgement before she melted into the shadows with her cubs following behind. "Will you miss this when it's time to go?" Sarah asked gently. Martha considered the question seriously. At 74, she was realistic about her remaining years, though the work at the sanctuary had stabilized her cognitive issues in ways that amazed her doctors. "I think when it's my time I'll be ready. But not because I'm tired or because I feel useless. I'll be ready because I'll know I used every day I was given for something that mattered." The sound of vehicles approaching broke the peaceful evening quiet. James emerged from his research station to greet the latest arrivals. a family from Ohio whose 12-year-old daughter had been struggling with severe depression following her father's death in a car accident. The sanctuary had developed a specialized program for grieving children, pairing them with young animals who were also learning to trust the world again. Martha watched the girl climb out of her parents' car, her face carrying the same hollow expression Martha had seen in her own mirror during the darkest days after Robert's death. By tomorrow, that child would meet the newest residents of the sanctuary, 3 bear cubs orphaned by illegal hunting, now learning to trust humans again under Luna's patient guidance. "It's going to be a good week," Martha said, already mentally preparing for the delicate work of helping a traumatized child discover that healing was possible. As darkness settled over the sanctuary, Martha reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she'd been a lonely widow convinced her best years were behind her. Now, she was a pioneer in an entirely new field of therapeutic wildlife interaction, a published author whose memoir, What Luna Taught Me About Love, had become an international bestseller, and most importantly, a woman who woke up each morning knowing her day would matter. The bears weren't the only ones who had learned to trust again. Martha had rediscovered faith in her own value, in the possibility of new beginnings, and in the transformative power of love that asks nothing in return except the chance to grow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals in need of healing, new people searching for purpose. But tonight, Martha Anderson fell asleep feeling grateful for every moment that had led her to this place, where an old woman and a wild bear had taught each other that it's never too late to discover who you were meant to be. Dear friends, Martha's story reminds us that our most meaningful chapters often begin when we think our story is ending. At 73, she discovered purpose, healing, and a love that transcended species, proving that age is not about what we've lost, but about what we still have to give. Like Martha, many of us fear becoming burdens rather than blessings. But her journey with Luna shows us that our wisdom, compassion, and willingness to help are exactly what the world needs most. Sometimes the greatest adventures await us when we stop trying to hold on to our youth and start embracing the unique gifts that come with our years. What moment in your life made you feel most needed and valued? Have you ever experienced an unexpected connection with an animal that changed your perspective on aging and purpose? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what another reader needs to hear today.